Hello, it is Amy. I am back at it again, and this time I have another episode of Buddy Banter, which means we are live on my channel. Yay! I only do this once a month because I'm in other live streams, and it's kind of nerve-wracking, and so I try to keep it to once a month. And I do it specifically Buddy Banter, which is where I have a friend come on my channel / now I'm a podcaster, so / podcast. And we talk about a topic of their choice. And today I have Lo the Lynx. You've seen them about, what, Lo, 3 times on my channel so far?
Yeah, that sounds about right.
So yeah, they are back again. And trust me, they will be back after this as well, because we have lots of couple names, but I think we've decided that Lynx Fire is going to be our couple name. But Lo and I have a wonderful friendship, and I was very excited that they agreed to come on for Buddy Banter. But before we get into it, you know how I do, Lo. I like to get those sweet, sweet plugs out in the beginning. So why don't you tell us what's going over at your blog? And for those that don't know you, what is your blog about?
Well, my blog is lothelynx.wordpress.com, and I do sort of intersectional feminist analysis of different types of fiction, mostly A Song of Ice and Fire and His Dark Materials. Sometimes I'll throw something else in as well, but mostly those two. And just this weekend, I think it was, I published an essay about His Dark Materials, where I wrote about navigating the world as a marginalized person, specifically in the HDM world as someone who doesn't have a demon. What is that like? How do people treat you? How do people mistreat you?
And those of you that don't know about His Dark Materials, the demon is basically an extension of your soul.
Exactly, but personified in an animal.
In a cute little fuzzy animal.
Super cute animal.
Anyway. Watch His Dark Materials just for the cute demons, especially season 2, which Lo talked about on my channel.
For the red panda.
Red panda!
Yeah, so I wrote about that, and then next essay is going to be about A Song of Ice and Fire and the Night of the Laughing Tree, and a sort of trans queer reading of that.
Awesome. I'm so excited for that one. Lo knows that I was creeping on them early on in the fandom, and reading their essays and loving them as well. So, and those of you in the chat and listening, they use they, them pronouns. So please make sure that you either use Lo or they, them when referring to them, because they are awesome. And I know you want to refer to how great they are. So thank you so much, Lo, for being on here and for plugging your stuff. I'm very excited. So now we're going to do for me. So those of you watching, you're on my YouTube channel, but just in case you forgot where you were, there it is, youtube.com/AmyBlackfire. I am in podcast form now. Check me out on Anchor, on Podbean, on Spotify, Google Podcasts, and I'm still working on Apple Podcasts. That's the big one. I'm hoping to be on there soon. I have applied. We'll see. And my blog is aswafchineselit.wordpress.com. I mostly look at A Song of Ice and Fire through an Eastern symbolism lens, but I have branched out to His Dark Materials, The Witcher, Avatar: Last Airbender, and soon The Poppy War, which I will have Lo back on for that. I was about to call you Lynx, which still works because it's the translation of Lo. But yeah, I'm very excited for that. I have a lot coming up for you all. I believe next Buddy Banter, I'm going to have Yogi on from Through the Moon Door. Moon Door is 2 words. And who knows what topic he's going to pick. You'll have to stay tuned. If you follow me on Twitter, then you will find out what the topic of that is before you get to watch it. So that'll be very fun. So please follow the links below. I do have my Twitter and Lo's Twitter as well as their blog. So yeah, and those of you that know, I preach the good word of the Poppy War every single time on this channel. Please read it. It is an amazing series. And yes, I am proselytizing everyone to it. Yeah, we're going to have a really good time. So let's go ahead and get into this topic, Lo. I'm so excited. So this is my 3rd episode of Buddy Banter with Lo the Lynx. And they picked a really interesting topic, which is about politics and contemporary issues in fantasy. We're also going to talk a smidgen about sci-fi, but we will stay mostly with fantasy. So you'll notice that the title kind of poses a question, and you probably know where we fall on that, audience, as far as can we separate politics from fantasy. So Lo, now it's officially tradition because this is the third time I've asked it. Why did you pick this topic?
Well, because sometimes when you hang out on the internet, people will argue that you should not bring contemporary politics into fantasy discussions. And as someone who is getting their master's currently in gender studies and focusing on trans studies, that is just a very strange idea to me, essentially. And I actually wrote an essay about a year ago now about how I cannot keep politics out of fiction because I was just a bit annoyed with people saying that you should. And I don't feel like it's possible to do that. So we'll get into why. But I felt like you were the perfect person to discuss this with. So
yeah, we've talked about this a couple of times after doing streams. We would be hanging out in backstage, the virtual backstage, and be talking about kind of how, we both do queer analysis and feminist analysis, and how the idea of kind of separating the art from the artist, and also separating contemporary themes from what is supposed to be in a medieval time, which we will definitely get to, and how we do believe, and those of you that are watching and listening, if you hold this opinion, we're going to be very respectful, but we do refute your opinion. And that is because it is a privileged position to separate issues of transness, issues of sexuality, issues of race and disability from fiction. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about. And we're also going to talk about themes within the fiction itself that are obviously reflections of our modern times. And so, Lo and I are both queer people, and it's because we are marginalized, it is difficult for us to separate it. And it does tend to be cis hetero white people that I've talked to about this who say that they can separate. And pretty much every other person I've talked to who's a person of color or queer person has said, you're crazy for even saying saying that, right? So I do think that's just kind of a disclaimer right off. We are going to be respectful, and we hope that those in the chat will as well. Mods, feel free to use that sweet, sweet banhammer of justice if someone is getting out of line. But we are here to talk openly about the themes that we see in this fiction, and why it's to us so obvious that you cannot separate this, and that the artist and this idea of death of the author irks us. And actually, let's start with this term, death of the author, Lo, because Barthes was the first person to talk about that, and he actually didn't mean it in the way that we use it now colloquially. So, Lo, have you read Barthes' Death of the Author in its original?
I have not, but I'm mostly aware of what he said, and that is, I mean, the point of that term originally was in a sort of literary analysis, like academic scholarly way. Should you ignore the intention of the author when analyzing it?
Yeah.
And I mean, that's not really how it's used, like you said, today in the discourse, especially online. But I know our friend Mary posted a really good question about that on Twitter, about what we think about that. And she's a very clever person who has read Barthes. Yeah, I know some people are annoyed by how death of the author is discussed currently, yeah, it's not always discussed in its original context, which I guess is a bit ironic given it's the death of the author. But yeah, I think I think you can make a point that in a sort of academic, scholarly way, you can decide to not focus on the intention of the author when analyzing, but at least I think in more like fandom discussions, I think it's very hard to ignore that, and especially to ignore the artist, and even more impossible to ignore the context in which they and we live.
Yeah, and Lo, it's been about 4 years since I read Death of the Author, but I did read it in a theory class, and I remember it being strictly about feminists, or pardon me, about, not with Bart, strictly about literary analysis, which is what you and I both do. And there's this idea that you can look at the text within its own world, separate from a creation of the author in their own time, right? And that's kind of, I think, what Bart was going for. And I don't necessarily disagree with how we've now colloquially, pop culturally interpreted that, but it is a way for, we'll talk about original intention, right? It's all about original intention when Bart is talking about what the author intended or taking that away. Well, Bart's, what he originally intended, it's kind of changed. So I think that we do take it as the more common way to say it is, can you separate art from artist, right? And so I actually, Lo, do you know that I like polls? I did a poll. That's what I do on my Twitter. So please follow me on Twitter. I love those sweet, sweet polls. And I did a poll, and I said that you and I were going to talk about contemporary politics and issues in fantasy, and asked if you either A, always separate art from artist, B, sometimes separate, or C, never separate art from artist. So I got 37 votes. So darn, come on, people. I want a little bit more than that. I usually like about 60 or 70 to say that it's, it's pretty representative. I've had like 300 votes sometimes on some polls, but we had 18% say that 18.9 exactly, say I always separate them. And then we had 78.4% say sometimes, and then 2.7 say never separate. So a lot of people are in the middle. I would say, Lo, that you and I are on never separate, or always separate, or never separate, sorry. We always see them as an extension of the author, whereas those who sometimes separate is the majority, because I think what that says to me, Lo, and feel free to interpret the data however you like. I see that as people say it depends, right, on if the artist, is this artist anti-Semitic? Are they anti-trans? Did they just say something slightly problematic, right? There's this idea of it depends, right, on the situation. And then there are people that always separate them. Almost 19% said that. So those are people who say that they are able to appreciate the art within its own universe and don't consider the artists themselves, which is kind of sort of getting close to what Bart was saying, but not quite. And a lot of people I hear all the time say that it's easier if the artist is dead, right? You can crap on H.P. Lovecraft very easily for his racism because he's dead. But then they find it a little harder for something that they have these childhood memories of, like with Harry Potter.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, for a long time, I tried to ignore J.K. Rowling. I swear I did. But it's just grown impossible. So, I mean, I feel that because I used to love Harry Potter. But I mean, we'll get into this later. But it's definitely very difficult to ignore the artists when they're alive and loud. It's easier if it's someone you know less about, or they're dead, and then it's easier to ignore it. But I still think it's very difficult to not consider context at all.
Yeah. And Lo, there are, this because you're in academics, there are really two schools of literary analysis. One that does kill the author and focuses on the work in itself, and then the other who integrates the biography of the author and their personal views into it. I am of the school that we should look at the biography of an author. So in all of my papers, when I'm looking at a novel or short story, if we know who the author is, which because I do Chinese literature can be difficult because of the time period I do, which is around 1600 to 1920, sometimes it's impossible to know who it is. However, if you do know who the author is, I always add biographical information in it, right? So, for example, one of the authors that I look at, he was born in 1895-ish and died in 1966 in China. So he was born during the last dynasty of China. And because he was not Han Chinese, he was Manchu, who were the ones ruling China. He had this privilege when he was born. He literally got a government stipend. All of a sudden, it's overthrown. And it's the Han Chinese kind of nationalism comes back and he is discriminated against. Like, you don't think that affected his literature? And then all of a sudden the communist revolution. And in the end, he killed himself because of the Cultural Revolution. You don't think that affected his literature, right? There are these traumatic things that happen in an author's life that if you ignore it, I think you're actually missing the bigger picture. And I don't think you can do micro-analysis unless you can do meta-analysis. I'll put it that way. If you can't see the bigger picture, how can you look at the details?
Yeah, and I mean, for me, I don't always focus on the biographical part, but it's definitely hard to ignore it, and you can't ignore it. And yeah, Anna made an incredible point. Who would have thought that Stephanie Meyer would be the less problematic than J.K. Rowling in 2020.
Exactly.
I would still argue that Stephanie Meyer is a bit problematic.
Yes.
I could go on a long spiel about the Twilight books, but yeah. Yes.
Margot has another great point here. I'll just read this out, especially for those. Thank you for listening in podcast form, those who are listening. Or if you have this YouTube video on in the background while you're washing dishes, we'll read this out for you. So Margot says, I feel like death of the author is often invoked to conveniently hand wave or ignore the biases or unsavory opinions of a creator that show up in a work, especially if it's implicit or subtextual.
Yeah, I feel like this comment just sums up my entire view of Harry Potter.
All right, we're done with the stream. Thanks for coming, everyone. Thanks, Margot.
Yeah.
Yes, but that's yes. I think she really hits the nail on the head there.
Yeah, definitely.
So actually, let's go ahead and jump into it. We're going to talk basically about 4 works, and those in the chat should be should be familiar with these. We're going to talk about Harry Potter. We're going to talk about Song of Ice and Fire / Game of Thrones. We're going to talk about His Dark Materials. And we're going to talk a little bit about The Mandalorian because of the latest news about Gina Carano. So would you like to start with Harry Potter, Lo? Or did you want to start with something else?
It doesn't matter to me, but I want to highlight the comment that Amy makes in the chat first.
Is it this one?
Yes.
Yes.
I feel like for me, death of the author doesn't mean ignoring everything. It just means that if you got something out of a text that wasn't intended, that can be valid. And I definitely agree with that. I mean, most of the things I write about are things that I don't think the author intended. They might have intended parts of it subconsciously, but I mean, I do a lot of trans and queer reading, and queer reading is sort of reading against the grain, finding the leakages of queerness in the text, and that often means that you find things that the author probably didn't intend. So I do agree with that point. But yeah, so.
Yeah, so that's the thing, is that we both do queer readings of fiction, and that is actually in many ways killing the author, because I doubt that J.R.R. Tolkien meant for Sam and Frodo to be examples of a queer relationship, but we could read it that way. That does not mean that he intended it. So Lo and I are not completely against that. However, when it comes to these problematic views and representations of minorities and marginalized peoples, that's where we draw the line. At least that's kind of what I've gathered from our discussions. So, this idea, as originally intended, talk about original intent, of Bart's, of looking at being able to read things in the text that weren't originally intended by the author, can be empowering, especially for queer literary analysis. However, it's when we start defending people and saying that they have freedom of speech that it can get murky. So actually, I know I said let's talk about Harry Potter. I want to go ahead and just address Gina right now, because she makes a freedom of speech claim, and hopefully the Americans in the chat know what I'm talking about when I say the Bill of Rights is Congress shall make no law, meaning it protects you from the government. So if the FBI was kicking down her door for her comments, right, she would have a valid freedom of speech argument. However, she has signed a contract with a private company, and aren't we capitalist, America? So the private company, as long as it's not discriminatory, can put anything in your contract. And Disney has a clause that you can't embarrass the brand, and she embarrassed the brand. And that's just that. So she can legitimately be fired. So freedom of speech, no, I don't buy that. That's bullcrap. What she essentially did is she compared her situation of facing consequences for her disgusting opinions and comparing that to the plight of the Jews during the Holocaust. That is inexcusable, absolutely inexcusable. And it's, I mean, I'm a goy. All right, I'm a Gentile. I'm not Jewish, but I am currently engaged to a Jewish man. So I really feel this in my soul that, there are people out there who lost family, and there were people who were disabled and who were queer who were killed just because of that during this time. So for her to compare herself to that is absolutely disgusting. It's insanely disgusting. And she doesn't deserve her own show. And I'm, right? So this was the perfect time to do it. Her spot on Mandalorian is done, but for them to have given her a new show and to go through with that after this, not just this, but her comments since last year and the year before that all come together and really show that she is not a good person and that she doesn't deserve to represent Lucasfilms or Disney. I mean, and look, Disney's problematic, especially when it comes to anti-Semitism. Don't get me started on that. But we're talking specifically about Gina here, and that she really shouldn't, right? There's this idea that she shouldn't be able to represent this, very important to a lot of geeks, Star Wars, right? She shouldn't be able to represent it. And so freedom of speech, I totally reject that claim. This idea that Disney is being unfair to her because she's right-wing. If you had someone who was left-wing and saying, we should kill Republican senators, they would also get fired. So I completely disagree with this idea that it's bias or that it is against her specifically.
Yeah. And also, no, I totally agree with her getting fired, by the way, but just if right-wing people want to complain about conservatives getting fired, maybe they should work to improve workers' rights so you can't get fired as easily. Just a suggestion. I don't know, maybe.
Yeah, and she's already gotten a new job with Ben Shapiro, so
yeah.
Bye,
of
Felicia.
course she's gotten a job with him.
Of course, yeah. The guy who talked about how it had a tirade against WAP, like saying that telling us what female sexuality should be. Isn't that so fun? Oh, I love it as a woman to be told, what is healthy for me in sexuality. That's we've been told that for generations, thousands of years. Anyway, this is not about Ben Shapiro, but he's a terrible person. And a lot of people, including Ted Cruz, said, "Oh, she's a strong woman in." DAP. She's a strong woman in sci-fi. We've had strong women and will continue to have strong women in sci-fi. What about Bobby from The Expanse, right? We have in Firefly, we have plenty of strong women. So I don't want to hear it that we're firing a strong female character because, Ted Cruz made that point because she was a Texan. Of course, he had to tweet about it. And I don't think that's a valid point because there are plenty of, especially women of color in fantasy, who are just as strong and don't have these insanely problematic views. So I'll leave that there, but I wanted to address the Gina Carano issue because it is in the news, and we picked this topic before this happened.
Yeah.
So it felt like we were kind of feeling this coming, and it was nice to have it. Anyway, so so that's that on Gita, and I'll leave it there because we want to get into kind of the meat of this topic as far as actually looking at fiction. So Lo, where would you like to start?
Maybe we should get the other topical topic out of the way too. I.e. the casting news about House of the Dragon.
Let's do it. So they announced some casting news. I was very excited to see this, and they are having a man of color play someone of Valyrian descent. Gods forbid, Lo. Wow.
Yeah.
The PC warrior, social justice warriors are killing us, Lo. It's killing Hollywood, and we're all gonna die.
Yeah, absolutely terrible. Obviously. Yeah, Anna makes a good point about Joss Whedon.
Joss Whedon is also
sucks.
Yeah, and yeah, so and we'll get into cancel culture as well. So,
yeah.
But yeah, so Lo, let's talk about this. The House Velaryon is of Valyrian descent. However, it is canon that they were not as protective of their eugenics bloodline as the Targaryens. So I argue that could be totally canon that the Velaryons could be people of color. And even if it wasn't canon, who cares? It depends on how talented actors are. If he can bring Corlys Velaryon, the sea snake, to life, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, they're also known for being a seafaring people, so to me it makes total sense that they would maybe hook up with someone from the Summer Isles, where people are canonically black. And I know Alicia on Twitter has talked a lot about this, and I mean, it does not say anywhere that Corlys Velaryon is a white person.
Yeah.
So why the heck does it matter? Some people argue that, he can't be black because the Targaryens are white and they intermarry. But I mean, people obviously don't know how genetics works with mixed race kids, and also it's a freaking fantasy world. So
Yeah.
obviously the genes are messed up anyway. We know that the genes don't really make that much sense if you look too closely at them in the books. I mean, the seed is strong, sure, but like some stuff just doesn't make that much sense if you look too closely. And it's a freaking fantasy book.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and I think also, and House Velaryon is actually my favorite minor house. So I was extremely excited to see them diversifying. And for specifically to pick the sea snake because he is so beloved in the fandom and he goes all over the world. And I won't call names, but there's a specific person in the fandom who is very influential and is actually responsible for starting a lot of the fandom, who will not shut the F up about this. And I want to cancel them a second time, but I've already canceled them once. But there is this idea that, I'm not being racist, I'm just trying to keep it canon. And I completely reject that altogether, because if you really cared about the character coming to life, you would just want the person who can do that. You wouldn't care about looks, right? It's about embodying that person. And so Twitter, when it was floated, and Twitter now that it's confirmed, is just Twitteros is blowing up with a bunch of racist bullshit, and I'm tired of it because we should be over so much of this, and we're not. We keep thinking, oh yay, diversity. Apparently, only if it says in the text this person is a person of color, right? We have in Here's Dark Materials a character who is mixed race, and it was never really said in the text if they were white or not, but people still, we're kind of like, that's a weird casting choice. And then for the House of the Dragon, Hot D, if you will, people are saying the quiet part out loud, and at least they're showing their themselves for us to see, right? But why do you care so much? I don't understand that view, and I think that it hurts the fandom as a whole to be like this, and you haven't even seen a pilot or anything. You know, I just can't wait for the show to come out and for all of them to shut up, because there were all of these things about the original casting for Game of Thrones that then turned out to be amazing, and I never heard anything again. So I'm just really excited for that. And yeah, and Amy has a great point. Like, why even try to reason with racists, right? And that's kind of a part of cancel culture, is that, and I hate using that term because it's usually used pejoratively, which is that it's not about going, oh, if they're older, oh, it was a different time, or oh, they just have a different opinion. No, it's social shame is all that works on some people. And so we have to use the tools that we're given.
Yeah, and also there's a really good passage in an article written by one of my favorite scholars, Sada Ahmed, where she writes that you can't have a discussion with someone when one part of the discussion people don't think the other part of the discussion are humans.
Yeah.
And she's specifically talking about trans people there, but I obviously think that counts here. You can't have like a civilized discussion with a group of with racists, because they, in the end, don't think all people are humans.
Yeah, like I couldn't reason with one of my racist grandpas, and I eventually just stopped, and I would just call him out and we'd fight, and you know, what could I do? I couldn't talk with him about this seriously because he legitimately did not think that people of color were people. So I also see it the same way kind of with, although it's not exactly the same, with climate change. If one side doesn't even recognize that it exists, we can't really have a discussion. This idea that both sides have valid points is not always true. And I think that's a really important point to make when we're talking about this. Just because there are two sides, that doesn't mean that they're both valid.
Yeah, exactly.
But anyway, so that's the casting announcement on Hot D. Sorry, I can't say it, the whole thing. But let's talk about the main series then, Game of Thrones. And what are some themes that we see in Game of Thrones that can be considered contemporary politics and issues that we really see George playing with? And I think one of them is this idea of power, specifically the attainment of power, kind of the suppression of the small folk, the idea of religion in power, right? There's a lot going on there, and really the symbol of the Iron Throne represents power. It represents holding, kind of ruling over all the seven kingdoms with legitimacy. And so I think that this idea of what is power, who deserves to have power, what is abuse of power, is very much can be a contemporary discussion and issue, because yeah, there's a monarchy and it takes place in a medieval time, but these discussions about kind of power are a little bit more, I hate to use the term enlightenment because it's kind of a little bit Eurocentric, but of the post-enlightenment discussions. This is not really something that they were necessarily talking about in the medieval times.
Yeah, and I mean, just if you look at the Iron Throne, for instance, I remember a few weeks back when the inauguration in the US was taking place. And for those who don't know, I'm Swedish, so I watched the whole thing on Swedish news, and it was extremely interesting to hear the commentary of that, and the journalists saying essentially, yeah, there's some official things happening here. You know, the Americans are very much about these specific ceremonies and specific images and symbols. And I just kept coming back to things that are said in A Song of Ice and Fire about, you have to have this certain symbols, and the thing that Melisandre says to Jon Snow, that he doesn't prop himself up enough. Because he doesn't take the place in the King's Tower or etc. And then you have like, who has the Iron Throne? is a huge symbol of legitimacy.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we can definitely see these issues in our world too currently.
And part of that also that was true in medieval times and is true in Game of Thrones, that is also a modern and contemporary issue that we talk about, is the role that religion plays in power. So, right, it's the High Septon that crowns the king, right? He has rules with the seven, right, as guiding him, right, or her, or they, or them, and so you also have religious extremism in the series with Lancel's character and the High Sparrow's followers. You literally have this idea of how religious extremism can work its way within the power structures, and it's always the small folk that are hurt the most when that happens. So even though the small folk, especially in the South, are mostly Faith of the Seven, they've mostly been proselytized in the Faith of the Seven, that doesn't mean that they're then not hurt by the hierarchy that does come with the Faith of the Seven, right? They always have this term that may the Father judge you. That kind of shows that, that the small folk can't really judge the upper classes because that's up to the Father, which is also common in Christianity, saying, oh, well, only God can judge me. Whenever, usually said when someone is not doing something well, but has also been used by the queer community to say, how dare you judge us? Only God could judge us. So religion is something that can be used by all sorts of movements. And I think specifically in Game of Thrones and in Song of Ice and Fire, religion plays a very important role, right? You also have Verlorism, and you also have the old gods and how that's kind of an aspect of Beyond the Wall and of the North that helps them kind of hold on to their identity, which identity, once again, huge thing in the series.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's extremely interesting that you bring up this point about only the Father can judge you. And not to enrage all of you good capitalist Americans too much, but it immediately, when you said that, reminded me of Marx and his idea of how religion is used to make people think that the current system is valid and legitimate, and to think that, oh well, maybe society sucks, but if I work hard enough and live a good life, then I'll get into heaven. And I mean, it's there's more to that theory than that, but essentially that different ideologies, including religion, works to uphold the current power structures. And I also just want to bring up that's a good point by Joe.
Yeah, great point by Yogi, who says another interesting thing in A Song of Ice and Fire is the rise of domestic terrorism in response to imperialism and marine. I think that George is directly making a parallel of when you go into another place and say, I know what's better for you. And of course, many people have talked about the racial implications of her, of mostly in the show, mostly people of color are Giscari. And then you have, right, the Silver Queen, this white woman coming in and saying, I know what's best. And of course, you're going to get the Sons of the Harpies uprising, just as we get in the Middle East, people uprising against imperialism. And so in the form of what we would call terrorism. And so there is this idea of fighting back through kind of guerrilla warfare, because the power is not there for the local people, right? So I think that the Miranese, and I actually was on, speaking of Through the Moon Door, I was on Through the Moon Door talking about Orientalism in the series, and the Miranese are very much an example of infantilization of the other by Dany. And Dany is my favorite POV and favorite character because I get to talk about Orientalism and imperialism, colonialism with her idea, or with her storyline. You can obviously also show how the children of the forest, right, are overtaken by the first men, who are then overtaken by the Andals. So you have this constant kind of movement and this constant idea of superiority that is going on in the series, and that's people, they're literally pushed to the margins, right? The giants and the children of the forest, and then the first men are pushed to the margins of the north, right? They're isolated there. And all the werewoods in the south are cut down, right? And maybe if we go 1,000 years in the future on Planetos, someone overtakes the Andal culture in Westeros, right? It's constantly being rewritten and changed. And the victor gets to, we have the maesters who are writing from very much from that Andal perspective.
Yeah, and speaking of the North, I remember listening to Girls Gone Canyon, and they made such an excellent point about what happens when Stannis and Melisandre gets up there and try to help, in quotation marks, the free folk by saying, "Oh, you can come south of the wall if you convert to our religion and give up your entire culture."
Yeah,
which is of course extremely similar to how colonial governments have worked in our world, with forcing people to give up their religion and their culture. And I think you could make a case that the free folk are a sort of indigenous people, even the children of the forest even more, but I think you could make an argument like that they are that the free folk are an indigenous people that have been forced into a very specific area by those in power, similarly to how indigenous peoples in our world have been constrained to certain areas when
and Alicia Kingston has a great point that it's not that slavery shouldn't be overturned in Slaver's Bay. It's that the way that it's done is very white savior. And I think that talking about thinking how the author is reflected in the works, because George was a anti-Vietnam War protester, right? That was an example of colonialism. That was an example of America going into Vietnam and saying, we need to save you from communism, right? And this idea that they had about the domino effect, that if one Asian country falls, they're all the same, right? So all the rest of the Asian country, which I'm an Asian studies major, and let me tell you, no, they are not all the same. They are very different. And Vietnamese have, especially in around the 700, 800s, were experiencing Chinese colonialism and were very anti-Chinese, and many continue to be today and have their own national identity. So no, they weren't just going to go, well, if the Chinese are doing it, let's do it. They were interested in Marxist philosophy. It wasn't because they were also Asian, right, that they were just copying the Chinese. So there is this side. So George was specifically, against this colonialist intervention. And then he's writing Game of Thrones, right? He's writing Storm of Swords, and then Clash of Kings, Storm of Swords, and then into the 2000s we get another colonialist intervention in the form of the Iraq. I mean, I want to say war, but it's like invasion, really, by the American troops. So we really do have that. George is seeing these contemporary issues, and he is obviously writing them into his fictional world, because these issues of colonialism are very much historically important. And and it wasn't, and it's, even though, right, I often hear, well, it's supposed to take times in medieval times, blah blah blah, this and that. There were plenty of colonialism in medieval times as well. It's just not in the way that colonialist theory necessarily would have defined it.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I've argued before that even if A Song of Ice and Fire takes place in a medieval-ish time, a lot of the ideas presented in the books are not medieval at all. I've talked at length about that on your channel before, Amy, about gender, for instance, and how I, as a gender studies person, definitely feel like the way gender is presented in the books that's not medieval. That's definitely post 19th, 18th century, really. And I've I've written about that loads. So while George is definitely interested in the medieval times, he also uses this fantasy realm to look at contemporary issues, I think.
We have an interesting question from Amy, which is, do you think the first men are portrayed as quote-unquote good because they adopted the indigenous beliefs of Westeros, or is this an accidental thing that George did? I actually see it as in the series, because now we later have the Andal invasion, and our current timeline in A Song of Ice and Fire is Andal supremacy, that they, in my opinion at least, the first men were put in the colonialized position, even though they were colonizers themselves only a couple of hundred years before. So I think if we didn't have the Andals there, and we're going back however many 1,000 years, and we see the first men invading Westeros before they took on these indigenous beliefs, and even maybe after that too, because they were still pushing the children of the forest to the margins, then they would be the colonizer. But it kind of flipped back on them and they became the colonized, which is, I actually think George is doing something here, which is that you might be the one on top today, but tomorrow, right, you're going to be the victim of the very same oppression that you put on others. That's kind of how I read it, Lo. How about you?
Yeah, definitely. Totally agree with that. I just wanted to address Yogi's question.
Yes, of course.
In the chat. And Yogi asks, Lo, do you think the way that the characters think about gender is not medieval, or the way Gurm writes about it? Both. And just like a quick history lesson, before the 18th century in Europe, people thought about, well, sex, not gender, but sex as, according to the one-sex model, which is that's a later term, but essentially it means that they thought that there was only one sex, the male sex, and women were just inferior, imperfect versions of the male sex.
Which can coming from Adam's rib, right? This idea that we're an extension.
Yeah, exactly.
Of course, as a woman.
Yeah, exactly. And it was very much like Greek philosophy themed. So women didn't have the correct balance of the fluids and all of that wonderful stuff. So according to my read of the books, I don't think that's how the characters think about sex, and I don't think that's how George has written about it. For instance, there are several mentions of characters calling women the gentler sex, the weaker sex, and just that language to me indicates that people in A Song of Ice and Fire see it as being two separate sexes, and not just one sex and an inferior version of that in perfect model of it. So yeah, that's the short, brief version of it.
Yeah, there is a lot of interesting. There's a lot of things in A Song of Ice and Fire and themes which are not just for 8th grade book reports. They are actually the center of all literary analysis, so they're just a little important to me as a literary scholar. But one thing I find interesting is his focus, especially in Arya's chapters, on the small folk, and we specifically get the Brotherhood without banners, who believe that they are going to protect the small folk. And one thing I find interesting, Lo, about the BWB is that they also kind of become corrupt. And I think this is George's kind of commentary on how even the most even the most pure of movements eventually kind of become overtaken, or there's a certain word I'm looking for and it's just not coming to my brain. But they co-opted, right? They eventually, right, you live long enough right, you either die the hero or you live long enough to see yourself the villain. And I think that the BWB really represent that. They had this really good idea about using the power of the king, because at the time they got it from the hand of the king, who at the time was Ned, and they did get this, they were using under the banner of the Iron Throne, they were going to better the Riverlands and to stop the tyranny that was ordered by Tywin. So you have these power structures kind of fighting, and the Brotherhood without banners are in the middle of it, just like the small folk, and they're trying to make a difference. But in the end, they do become corrupted, and religion, once again, this R'hllorism, starts to seep into it, to where it's they're starting to think that they have the license to do whatever they want, even terrible, violent action.
Yeah, and if that is not relevant today, I don't know what is. I was just talking the other day with a friend about corporate feminism, for instance, and the way that big capitalist corporations try to make money of feminism, and how that's obviously a corruption of the idea of feminism and feminist movement in a lot of ways. Yeah, and Yogi said, poor Catelyn died a hero and still became a villain.
Yeah, and then I like this follow-up. Give this lady a break. Yeah, but this idea also of life and death, which is another huge theme for George, is also a question of, right, Thoros of Myr keeps bringing him back to life, and that's unnatural. And I think it's very obvious in the series that this is unnatural, right? We have the others, we have Lady Stoneheart, we have Beric Dondarrion. I think the point is that just because you think you have a right cause and you're bringing someone back to keep fighting that cause, that doesn't make it right.
Yeah, definitely. And you could obviously talk about, I don't know, bodily autonomy in that situation. I mean, in our world, you have to sign up to be a donor after death. So is it ethical to bring someone back from life if they have not stated that they would like that to happen?
Yeah. Where's maybe, they needed DNRs back then. Yeah. Saying, let me die. And also talking about this religious movement that thinks they're right. I really do think the High Sparrow is an excellent example of, frankly, a cult leader who thinks that they have the answers and that they're fighting for the small folk, just like the Brotherhood without banners are, right? He wears this kind of humble clothes, and he professes to be fighting for the small folk, but he's using that power actually for a lot of get ready to drink low, a lot of patriarchal bullshit, because the Walk of Shame is essentially the control of female sexuality that is an extension of the High Sparrow's cult. And also, that actually, Lo, I don't know if you know this, but in America, we do have this colloquial term, walk of shame, which means you sleep with a guy and the next morning you do the walk of shame. So I think that George is very aware of this gendered aspect of women should be ashamed of sex, whereas, men get a high five for being... for being, you're right. I hate to use these terms, but you're a player if you're a guy, and you're a slut if you're a girl. And once again, I hate to use that term. It is a patriarchal, oh my God, again, term. It's misogynistic term, getting on to women for having sex.
Yeah, and I mean, a while back I wrote an essay about virginity norms in A Song of Ice and Fire, because I have so many opinions about the whole idea of there existing a maidenhead that can be broken.
That's a great essay. Please check out, once again, I'm going to put your link back up here. Your links, get it? There you go, right? Lo has this amazing essay about the idea of maidenhood and the maidenhead and virginity in the series, which they really give it a 1-2 punch and knock it out as a concept.
Yeah, background info for that. I also work with sexual education and have to quite often explain to teenagers that no, the hymen does not exist. You don't always bleed the first time you have vaginal intercourse, and you cannot look at someone's vagina and tell if they have had sex before, which they do seem to believe in A Song of Ice and Fire.
Yes.
And just recently, I read an article about how private clinics here in Sweden, in Stockholm, would do examinations of people to look if their hymen was broken or not, which is like very unethical to do that. So
and this obsession with the genitals in general is such a heteronormative, misogynist, just disgusting way to look at the body and sexuality. And it also, we're just now starting to talk about asexual people. The fact that some people don't want it at all should always be considered when we're talking about sexuality, which is not, which is which a lot of people talk about the blackfish as gay. And I actually always bring up, whenever that comes up, what if he's asexual? There's always, there are some, these people have existed forever.
Yeah.
It's just a question of terms. And so I think another idea of power, right? Going back to that, another idea of it is George has compared the dragons to the atom bomb, right? This idea of having something that the other side doesn't, and using that as a threat against them, literal fire and blood, right? So they're also a representation of power and he literally compares it to dropping the bomb in World War II. And that is a contemporary issue of using, what would be considered advanced technology against a foe that is not able to protect themselves against it. And here we are, there's a picture showing people burning in the background, right? Not just using the dragons, but the threat of the dragons alone really, for George, represents using the threat of the bomb against people.
Yeah, I mean, that was the whole Cold War, wasn't it? Being afraid that other side would decide to employ the bomb. And to get back to the Poppy War briefly, that's also mentioned. The bomb is also alluded to in that book. So I mean,
chemical warfare is also used in the book as well. Yeah. So you do have this idea of using advanced weapons, and it's specifically an extension of colonialist power, right? America literally, wiped clean 2 major Japanese cities, and that was considered victory. So it really, George is obviously playing with this contemporary and modern ideas of weapons of mass destruction. And, you can say chemical warfare or biowarfare, right? Technically, the Mongols used that they would send over people who had died of the plague in trebuchets over the wall, so that they would just get everyone sick in the city, and they would either leave or die, and then they could just enter the city. So these are technically medieval concepts, but brought to a level that is, I mean, the dragons themselves is just a way higher level than, a flamethrower, if you will.
Yeah.
Right? The amount of destruction they could do with, first of all, aerial power and then literal firepower is very much representative of dropping the bomb and creating devastation on the ground. And so that's very, very, that's very much an example of how George is integrating what he saw in, his growing up and having, he would have had parents that were alive during World War II, and kind of hearing this American rhetoric about victory through this weapon that now more countries have, not just America, but at the time it was supremacy. It represented supremacy. So that's the dragons as, weapon is definitely an extension of power that George is playing with.
Yeah, absolutely. That is definitely the case. And I think we got Shiloh in the chat now.
We do, yes.
So
Shiloh wrote the book on medievalism in A Song of Ice and Fire.
Yes.
And has a great, I think pretty early on in the book, has a great line about how, which we directly quote in our Les Saint-Omar essay, Lo, about how fantasy reflects contemporary woes. And I think that she makes that argument very, very well and clear in her book.
Yeah, definitely. So you should all check that out.
Yeah, literally wrote the book. We're not using it as a term. She literally wrote a book, Medievalism: A Song of Ice and Fire, by Shiloh Carroll. Pick it up at your bookstore near you, or order online because Rona. But yeah, so there. I really like the way that she approaches it, as she, I think, like us, doesn't take it as an axiom that it's a medieval time and therefore we should change the way that we look at it. Like, this whole stream is about that we are incapable, me and Lo are incapable of doing that. Because we see it so clearly. We've gone over these themes of power, of gender, and of, ableism too. We could talk about Penny and Tyrion and classism. Tyrion, right, had this great life even though he was born disabled, whereas Penny had to become an entertainer and a joke in order to survive, right? So classism is also huge, a huge theme of that, which, one thing I like about, I love Monty Python Holy Grail, but one thing I like about it is they have that they have that one peasant who was talking about Marxist issues essentially in a medieval time, right? So even though I'm sure there were people at that time who were lower class being like, I hate how the upper class get everything, there wasn't this like kind of French Revolution, Marxist bourgeoisie versus the proletariat, right? But we can still look back at these times through that lens, and it fits every time. And I think George shows us through Song of Ice and Fire, through the small folk and through the control of the people via religion and idea of bloodlines, right? And eugenics themselves, right? And that's a very obvious theme through the Targaryen bloodline. That is all expressed through a quote-unquote medieval timeline, right?
Yeah. And as those who have read my essays know, I've talked extensively about trans issues in the books. And if we just go back to Arya and she has all these interactions with the small folk. And one of the scenes that really made me start thinking about her from this gender non-conforming perspective was when in Clash she obviously dresses up as Aerie, the boy, and then gets discovered to be like biologically female because she has to go pee in front of people. And that to me was just such a trans moment that so many people, including Jack Halberstam, for instance, have written about how.
And I'm sure brave Danny Flint at the Night's Watch.
Exactly.
Plug. I have a future essay comparing her to Hua Mulan, and as well as Alaris Sorella. Alaris probably has come across that same moment.
Yeah, where you have to, risk getting discovered when using a bathroom, and there's a million things to be said about the idea that your body says anything about your gender, obviously, but just that safety situation that Arya is in Clash is really powerful to me. How she feels like she has to dress up as a boy to be more safe, not as at risk for sexual violence. But as any trans person or trans scholar could tell you, if you're discovered to, be in disguise, then you're probably even more at risk for violence, including sexual violence.
And this is something that you wrote about in the Alaris/Sorella essay that really, especially because, Alaris is technically their chosen name, so I want to use the right one, but you write about how people assume to use he, him, and maybe they're non-binary. First of all, that was one of the great illuminations from that, but also the idea of they're also a person of color. And so the threat of sexual violence is even more there for sure. So I really enjoy that essay. So once again, plug, check that out. But there was a great line by
Yeah.
Dornstein going back to this idea of the bomb. And that was that there were some arguments at the time that, oh, we would kill fewer people by dropping these bombs and getting Japan to surrender than if we were to actually send troops in. And that's kind of the argument as Dornstein makes this point. That's kind of the argument Tywin uses for the Red Wedding, right? If we kill a few at dinner, right, that would have been fewer people. I hear Stannis in my head, not less, fewer, right? Fewer people than if they were to continue this War of the Five Kings, right? And that, in the end is a really I don't know a pessimistic way to look at it. And it's also, I think, trying to justify horrible acts of violence, especially in Westeros, where we have this idea of guest right being violated, which is another huge theme.
Yeah, obviously. And also Tywin is full of crap because they didn't just kill a dozen at dinner, they also killed all the soldiers in the camps outside of the Twins. So it was a huge massacre. So he's just trying to make himself feel better or look better or something.
Yeah, it's this justification that, to me doesn't hold water. And I think that that's exactly kind of what George is saying. They also make the argument. There were a lot of arguments like that in Vietnam during the Vietnam War about if we do this, it kills fewer people, and that this idea of let's support the South Vietnamese government and get them to sacrifice their troops because then it's fewer American troops. If we support this government, then we're looked at as more legitimate when it's still an invasion. So I think that is also this kind of regime change that America and many colonial powers have engaged in over the years is something that is reflected in the series as well. And also something like we see in Marine, like we see in the North, is that whatever culture was already there is still going to be there, right? Even the children of the forest, you can push them to the margins and you can almost push them to extinction, but there will always, that'll still always be there. And so we really see that we see that a lot in real world examples. I'm a Chinese studies major, so we see that with the Uyghur and the Tibetan people, many different marginalized peoples in China. They will be marginalized but never fully gone. The Dalai Lama did escape to India and still claims and does in many ways represent himself, the religious, the Tibetan Buddhism specifically. So I think that that's also something that George is trying to say, is that this imperialist idea that people can be converted and changed is that is successful, unfortunately, but it will never be fully eradicated, basically, is what I'm saying.
Yes, definitely. And that applies to so many contexts throughout the world.
Yeah, and you also, we'll get into his dark materials here in a second, but you also write a lot about the Sami people and how the many people in Sweden think that, there's going to be the final nail in the coffin, right? For these indigenous peoples. You can say the same thing in Alaska with the Inuit people. They're still there. And they're First Nations people in Canada. So there's a lot of examples of this that push to the margins but never gone. But unfortunately, downtrodden, definitely, and discriminated against.
Yeah.
So did you want any closing thoughts about Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones until we get into one of our other fiction works that we want to talk about?
I mean, not really. I feel like we've covered
covered a
much.
lot. Yeah, we used most of those I think everyone in the chat we've met through the Song of Ice and Fire community. So we wanted to give the full first hour to our this specific fiction work. And there's a lot going on. It's a huge series.
Yeah.
So what's next, Lo? Do you want to go into his Dark Materials or Harry Potter?
We could do Harry Potter first, maybe.
Let's do
because J.K. Rowling.
Yes, because Rowling. We've gotta get it here. So where do we start? Her campaign against quote unquote cancel culture, and her idea that she should not face consequences for her terrible discrimination against trans people, and her representation of TERFism has caused many people, including myself and Lo, to rethink their support of the franchise, because it is a huge franchise. I mean, there's Harry Potter World. There's I think they've announced that they're going to do a series. There are obviously the movies made her a lot of money. The books made her a lot of money. So she has this. She keeps writing these essays against cancel culture and expressing her TERF views. And for those of you that don't know, TERF is trans-exclusive radical feminism, which she claims to be a feminist who does not accept trans women into the movement, which, as Lo and I both talked about, not very feminist.
Yeah. And also she doesn't think that non-binary people exist, basically. Especially if they were assigned female at birth, then they're just confused and has a lot of internalized misogyny, according to her, which is obviously not true. For me personally, I really, really loved Harry Potter growing up. It was a huge part of my life. I met so many people through the online fandom, and it was just really a safe place for me in a way growing up. As you know, a queer nerd, I wasn't that popular in school, so Harry Potter was sort of a safe haven. And I mean, I even when I turned 18, I got a Harry Potter tattoo that I have since covered up. Because I just could not look at it without thinking about how much this woman would hate my very existence.
And invalidate it completely. And she also reflects some problematic views within the franchise or within the work. There are a lot of things that we can point to, but maybe we should start with the goblins. This is not subtle. I'll just say that. For those of you listening in podcast form, I've just put up a picture of one of the goblins literally hugging coins and money. And with the big nose, it's very obviously a representation of the Jewish people. I don't know if she has confirmed or denied this, but honestly, I don't think it matters, because the greediness and having a large nose is very obviously a dog whistle, and it's not subtle. It's more like a megaphone.
Yeah, and also the long fingers.
Yes.
There's I know one of the Harry Potter podcasts that I do listen to, The Quibbler, made a really good point about this when they covered the last part of Deathly Hallows, that Griphook's fingers are constantly pointed out as being like long and claw-like, pretty much. It's not subtle at all.
It is really problematic, and this is something also that is discussed in about Tolkien. I believe it's the dwarves we do have him Tolkien quoted as they represent the Jewish people. And that was in the 30s. We're talking about the 2000s. So, not to say, oh, it was a different time, so it's okay for Tolkien to do it. I'm just saying that Rowling should know better, basically. And so it's just, it's really, it's really uncomfortable to see that, because then you really have obvious anti-Semitism in in the series, and it's also literally turning them into what looks like monsters, and they're unhelpful, right, to Harry. He has to like convince them to do things. He has to kind of trick them into doing things. They're seen as they're the protective of these vaults of money. And from a course that I took in undergrad, Jews in Medieval Christendom, it was because Jews, there was this thought by Christians at the time that it was ungodly to be a moneylender. So the Jews were made to be merchants of moneylenders. So it's not like some kind of natural thing about being Jewish is you want to do this. It was a cultural thing that they were essentially forced into this work because the Christians wouldn't do it. So but people who are anti-Semitic assume that Jewish people are inherently greedy. And so this is kind of perpetuating this stereotype with these goblins at Gringotts, basically. Did I say that right? Gringotts? It's been a while, because like I said, I don't I haven't I have not consumed any Harry Potter content in a long time.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I mean, there's also this idea that you can't trust the goblins, which is obviously extremely problematic if you consider how Jewish coded they are. Yeah, and I just need to say that Rohan is in the chat and being freaking delightful. I don't know if we should pull up the quotes, but just I love you, Rohan. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, long fingers. Maybe they're lesbians too.
Yeah.
Representation. Yes.
Yeah, but I don't. You can say that, oh, kids wouldn't pick up on this, but I think that kids understand more than we give them credit for. And I always say that when it comes up to, oh, kids won't pick up on this or that. I think that we don't give kids enough credit for what they will understand and what they will pick up on.
And even subconsciously, it'll like start that reference in their head, and they'll start that association process. Yeah.
Yeah, and I also think you also mentioned that you wanted to talk about Cho Chang or Cho Chong. I'm gonna say it in the. Here's the thing. I'm sorry. I'll say it right now. I'm an Asian Studies major. Cho is a Korean first name. Chong is a Chinese last name. Is she mixed, or does J.K. Rowling just not do any research? And she's just like, these are Asian sounding things. Yay, I have a person of color in my series. I mean, what is happening? If she was going for full Korean, her last name should be Jang. Jong. I'm just saying. I'm sorry. This like it as an Asian studies major just irks me so much.
Yeah, I just it's ridiculous. She did not do research, I would say.
Yeah. Everyone's like, yeah, no, zero research. Yeah, definitely. And I just think that Cho represents a half-assed attempt, basically, at representation. And she also, chose an Asian woman, and it's historically known that white people will kind of, see the stereotypes of Asians as smart and basically almost white. Before World War II, a lot of white people actually basically said that Japanese people were almost white. I mean, it's there. It wasn't until World War II that they were, oh, well, there's different race, right? There were actually Japanese people who migrated to America before World War II that checked white on their immigration form. So, you know, as far as like a dark person, you know, that's not really there.
Yeah, and also, I mean, most of her role is to be a love interest for Harry, which also feels like a very stereotypical role for an Eastern Asian woman to be placed in.
Very much eroticized. Yeah, which is a part of Orientalism. Definitely. So we have Cho, who's obviously there. You wanted to also talk about Umbridge and Rita Skeeter. What were you thinking about that? Give us your feels and your thoughts.
Okay. So my hot take about women and girls in Harry Potter is that they're either mothers in a good way or in a bad way. I mean, we have Lily and we have Petunia, obviously, but they're either mothers or like motherly, like McGonagall, or they're like silly young girls. Think like Parvati, Cho to a certain degree, Lavender, or they're like feminine but in a bad way, in a wrong way, and that's both Umbridge and Skeeter to me fits that latter part. So I actually wrote an essay about this a while back, but if you look at how they're described, it's very much that they're very feminine. Like Umbridge is always wearing pink. In the books, it's described that she has a girlish voice, but she's also like, it's very clear from the books and the dialogue that all the characters think she's somehow presenting feminine in a wrong way. It's like it's too girly, and it's very much to me connected to her age, that is like not appropriate for her to be this girly as an somewhat older woman. And if you look at that from a sort of queer studies perspective, you could definitely see that as a sort of queer femininity, in a way that it's like seen as inappropriate. And just to name drop a wonderful scholar who's written a lot about this, Ulrika Dahl. She's a Swedish professor in social anthropology, and also a wonderful human being that I have met several times. And she writes a lot about queer femininity and femme, and the sort of subversion of gendered expectations by being like an older woman who dresses femme and like trashy in some ways, and like what types of feminine presentations are deemed as wrong. And I feel like both Umbridge and Skeeter are this type of wrong queer femininity in some way, in that they Skeeter is always described as wearing like super long nails and lots of jewelry, and all again is portrayed as very wrong in some ways. There's something that's not like respectable and proper about it. And I think that's very much connected to their gender presentation and their age, and that they somehow don't fit into this linear path you're supposed to travel through life. You can be girly when you're younger, but when you start getting up there, you're supposed to change your appearance to be more respectable. And these women don't do that, and in that way they're not proper, and they're in a way almost queer coded in that way. And obviously there's a long tradition in both in books and in movies, and that the bad guys are queer coded as a way to express that they're the bad guys, because being queer is obviously bad.
I also think that Rita Skeeter represents this kind of obsession with gossip and scandal, which is
Yeah.
very much a sexist trope of women. And she's manipulative, right? She'll always write the headline to make Harry look as bad as she possibly can. She's always on the sidelines, listening in, trying to spin the story in a certain way. This is very much a harmful trope about women, that you can't trust them because they're always looking for a way to spin it in a bad way. And I think also particularly her obsession with Harry Potter is a little creepy as well. I'll just put that out there.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely agree. Yeah. And Rohan asked about Fleur in the chat.
Let me find that question. She's asking kind of where Fleur, I'm bad at anything French, where she kind of fits into this commentary, the line of thought that we're doing, Lo. She says, she's kind of feminine and has this idealized beauty, but then she's also kind of framed as a cool girl as well.
Yeah, I think that in a way, yeah, I also like Fleur. She's sort of the ice queen, at least in the beginning of the fourth book. I feel like she's like the popular girl that the guy thinks is hot, but she's not. You can't really approach her. And Hermione definitely doesn't like her. And I feel like that's a contrast to Hermione, who's definitely like one of the guys. She's that type of stereotype that she's not girly, and that's a good thing. And she doesn't like Fleur because she's too girly. But then Fleur is actually a cool person. It turns out, you learn in the sixth book that she's not just focused on looks. And I feel like in the beginning you're not supposed to like her because she's so like focused on her looks and appearances, or so it seems. And then you realize that, oh, she's not only interested in that, so then she's a cool person. And I feel like with Ginny, for instance, she's also more one of the guys. She's a huge Quidditch fan. So girls can be cool if they're not too girly and not too interested in their looks. I feel like that's sort of the message.
I think she's also a little bit exoticized as well. As being a French beauty, femme fatale kind of thing going on. And reflective reading has a good point that Hermione is the smart girl, right? And she has to kind of, especially I believe in the fourth book, kind of literally do like the 1980s rom-com thing where you like take off the glasses and put on some makeup and put your hair down and you're beautiful and feminine all of a sudden. So very much J.K. Rowling is definitely playing with this this trope that is I think also harmful to women. It puts good looks ahead of intellectual prowess, basically.
Yeah.
So that, yeah, we see a lot of problematic gender things, and the fact that Rowling does believe there are only two sexes and two genders and that they're the same thing, also very problematic. I'm sure there are some fanfics out there that insert trans characters or something into Harry Potter, and that would have been nice to see, because wizards and just wizards and witches. They're doing the same thing. Annoying. They both use magic. Why can't we all be wizards, or why can't we all be witches, or why can't we just all be magicians, right? Just try and pick a term that, like, what is the difference between what Hermione does and what Harry does? Well, the fact that he's got the scar and all that stuff. You know what I'm saying, right? They're both magic users. The fact that we have two separate terms alone shows that she is very much thinking in the binary, and something that Nessie and I talked about on Nessie's channel, The Unspun Yarn. Please check that out. We were talking about how the binary is ingrained into people's thinking, and very much it's ingrained into the Harry Potter world.
Yeah, I mean, it's constantly gendered. You have the girls' dormitory and the boys' dormitory, and I know a lot of trans folk have been talking about, well, where would a trans person or a non-binary person fit in? Um, and I mean, obviously, that's true to our world too. Look at all the gendered places, the bathrooms, the changing rooms.
Yeah, and there's also something that I've been kind of inserting in the chat while we've been talking is we can support so many other female authors who, like Ursula K. Le Guin,
Yeah,
who has an amazing fantasy series called Earthsea series from the 70s or 60s, I believe, maybe 70s. And, you know, there are women of color who are writing amazing fantasy and sci-fi. And there are so many people that we can be supporting instead of this. And also, I believe J.K. Rowling made it mainstream not just because of the quality of her stories, but also because she is a cis white woman, and
yeah,
it made it very easy to get noticed. And you know, she was obviously poor in the beginning and then became really rich, but it's very uncommon for trans people and people of color to have that kind of quote unquote rags to riches story that
yeah,
that JK experienced and enjoyed.
yeah,
So I think we also need to recognize how the society and how the audience itself is very receptive to this kind of story that is even though it's in that's the thing is it's a world where magic exists but we can't have a trans person. That makes no sense. You
yeah,
know, it's supposed to not be our world, and yet she imposes all of her terrible real world takes on this world.
yeah. And reflective rambling has another good point that I agree with. That tongues can definitely be read as non-binary. I personally read tongues as non-binary, but again, that's a queer reading that I do that was definitely not intended by the author.
Exactly, and that's where death of the author can be empowering and beneficial to marginalized people, which
Yeah,
we kind of referenced at the beginning. Here's an actual example of that, where it can actually be a good thing. But I think that at least for me, Lo, and since you got a tattoo, I think you feel the same way. Saying these things are because we originally really cared for the material itself.
yeah,
And if we didn't care about it and it wasn't important to popular culture and society, then there wouldn't be much to say about it. But because it has affected, you know, generations,
mm,
it is important to realize and recognize when it falls short and when the author is harmful, because she does have a big platform
yeah,
and she does make a difference to a lot of people what she says. And there are a lot of people out there who hold these bigoted views of trans people and feel validated because someone like J.K. Rowling said it.
yeah. I mean, I've seen politicians quoting and referencing her. So,
And people who don't even agree with her but say she's right about cancel culture, right?
yeah,
They go, oh, forget the anti-transness. She's right that people shouldn't face the consequences of their bigotry. And that is also disgusting. That
yeah,
people kind of pick and choose what she's saying and then use that to elevate their own views.
yeah,
You know, so that's if she was just some Joe Schmo, it wouldn't matter. But she has, you know, millennials and Gen Z specifically, she has affected the way that we look at fantasy. You know, whenever I'm reading the Poppy War and Reen goes to this training school, I think of
yeah,
Hogwarts. How can I not? So, and there are a lot of you know, I look at how Reen treats Najah, and I'm like, oh, that's Harry versus Draco. So
yeah,
these tropes are there, and we have names to them, you know, for her. And just like with Tolkien, right? You talk about the journey and going to Mordor, you know. So a lot of times when we talk about A Song of Ice and Fire, we say, oh, that's like in Tolkien's blah 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 blah, right? She set some tropes, and because of that, she, you know, she is influential and she does have a platform, and that platform can be taken away if we set aside our own attachment to something just because we like it. Just because you like it doesn't mean that what she's saying is not hurtful to people like Lo and people like me.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that that's, and not to mention people of color. I mean, the lack of you know, children of all colors want to be a wizard. What, you know,
Yeah.
why but they don't see themselves at Hogwarts. And I think that is the pain is real. And saying, well, I like Harry Potter, so it doesn't matter, is really invalidating to people. And I
Yeah.
think that's what we're trying to say specifically when it comes to Harry Potter, is just because you like it. You know, like I said, anyone who's told me that they can get over the Harry Potter thing, they were always cis white. You know, that's that. I've never, I've talked to plenty of people of color, queer people about this, and we're of the same mind about it. So, I think that, to me, that says something.
Yeah, and I feel even when I've talked to like queer people or people of color who say, well, I still love the books, everyone is always super clear that even if the books will always have a place in our hearts, we cannot, with good conscience, support her monetarily. So that I feel like is, even if the books always have some place in your life, it's ethically irresponsible to give her more money or more exposure.
And people talk about cancer culture. Boycott culture has been here since the 1500s, right?
Yeah.
During the early 1900s, a lot of Chinese people were boycotting Japanese goods because of their aggression against Korea. A lot during World War II, there was this Buy American campaign. Unfortunately, it is usually infused with nationalism. I will make that caveat. However, this idea of boycotting something because it does not match your views has been around for a very long time. So to act like all of a sudden these liberal snowflakes are having cancel culture is historically inaccurate. The boycotting products has been here for a very long time. So, there were people that were boycotting opium coming out of India because they were against British imperialism. I mean, it's always been there. And so I think to all of a sudden act like this is something that needs to be done away with. Our wallet reflects our values for a lot of people in this world. Yeah. And I think that also, just for example, Chick-fil-A. I haven't been to a Chick-fil-A in 10 years, and I won't, because of the hiring practices. They say they're better now. I don't give a crap. That was what they originally represented to me, and I don't eat chicken anyway, so it's really not much of a loss. I did like the waffle fries, but anyway. So that is this idea of boycotting is just cancel culture is just an extension of that. And I don't use cancel culture in a pejorative way, because I boycott a lot of things. I haven't been to a Walmart in over 10 years either.
Yeah.
I find other things. There are always small businesses you can support that are not terrible. So, for me, canceling Harry Potter was difficult, but I think that as long as I have a clear conscience, I will be happy. And that's, at the end of the day, I need to be able to fall asleep and think that at least me as a small person, right, just one person, is at least my conscience is clear.
Yeah.
But anyway, so last thoughts on Harry Potter, Lo?
I just want to bring up one thing really quickly, and then we can move on. J.K. Rowling is also somewhat like infamous for inserting diversity after the fact. For instance, saying Dumbledore is queer, or saying that being a werewolf is a metaphor for having HIV and AIDS. And I just want to talk a bit about that.
Yes, definitely.
Because...
And you said that Rowling herself has mentioned this, so you're not bringing this out of thin air, right?
No, she has said that she sees this condition that is stigmatized as a parallel to HIV/AIDS, and that starts to break down quite quickly. Well, not break down, but starts being very problematic quite quickly if you look closely at it. Because obviously Lupin, we like Lupin, he's a good guy, and he gets discriminated for being a werewolf. But like there's also the evil werewolves. For instance, Fenrir Greyback, who bit Lupin, who he used to have the practice of deliberately biting kids who were enemies to Voldemort, and that is obviously super problematic if you see that as a parallel to HIV. And he's also very much described as a sexual predator who often goes after kids, including both boys and girls and everyone in between. And if you then see HIV as being a werewolf, then you immediately get into extremely problematic views about like people deliberately spreading HIV and people having it being like perverts in some way, which is just terrible.
Yeah, and I think obviously the association between being gay and contracting AIDS, I don't know about now, but certainly in the 80s, the colloquial term in China was 同性病, literally gay disease for AIDS. So globally, unfortunately, it has, in the 80s, it was associated with the LGBTQIA plus community.
Exactly.
And so to make that comparison is just churns my stomach. And I was today years old when I heard about it. This is my first, before we started the stream, Lo, you told me that you wanted to talk about this, and I was disgusted. So this is still raw for me. I haven't had the chance to process this. It's the more you learn about something, the more you're going to see its flaws. Absolutely. But the amount and the severity of the flaws that I'm starting to see in Harry Potter is alarming, and I think is something that it's Amy has a great point. She just keeps digging the hole. Yeah. I mean, if you find yourself in a 6 foot hole, stop digging. I don't understand. Like she's got to be at the Earth's core pretty soon. She just keeps digging. And I don't understand why she can't just let these things go. And I think it comes from privilege. Yeah. She thinks that and it's power dynamic. She thinks as a white woman in England, she can speak on these issues. Yeah. And she can't. Like, you're either an ally or you shut up. That's just kind of how I am about this kind of thing. Your ideas are wrong and you should go away. That's like basically the TLDR of how I feel about it. I don't understand why she still has a platform and why people still listen, and why people still defend her. Because you can still have great memories about reading the books and seeing the movies, but be realistic about who she is as a person and how it affects the literature itself. It's not like she has this great, she's created a world that is without these views. Like I said, just the witch and wizard binary alone shows that that's seeped into her literal magical world that should be boundless possibilities.
Exactly. Okay.
Okay, I'm done. My feels are all out, Lo, about this, about Harry Potter. So let's go ahead and talk about his Dark Materials. And those in the chat that haven't seen it, these aren't going to be. It's not going to be terribly spoilery, I don't think. We're mostly going to be talking about themes. And so just sit back and relax. If you haven't heard about his Dark Materials, we're at least going to talk a little bit about how religion and power and other contemporary issues play in the series. And Lo and I have both read the books and seen the first 2 seasons of the show. So let's maybe talk about the Magisterium first,
Mm.
as it is a political and religious power that it controls the main world in the series. Lyra's world is the main character, so specifically her world. And Lo, something that you talked about in the episode that you and I did together about colonialism in his Dark Materials, you talked a lot about Nazi parallels and this idea of specifically, are you ready for it? Patriarchal control that the Magisterium represents. And Philip Pullman, the author himself, specifically says that he likes to write about church and state and how integrated they can be, and kind of write against those issues.
Yeah, so I mean, the magisterium is quite obviously a parallel to Christianity in our world, even if in this parallel universe they have an even stronger hold on society than they do in our world. And there are definitely parallels to eugenics and the Nazis and similar things. I mean, in the picture you showed just recently, that's from the second season of the show, they have made the magisterium symbol, this cross thing, look extremely similar to the Air Force symbol of the Nazis during World War II. That crosses, if you Google it, it's extremely similar. And also, I've talked about before how on the show they seem to very deliberately parallel the costumes of the magisterium
Yes, they
soldiers.
have these armbands.
Yeah, exactly.
Which could also represent, I don't know how much Pullman knows about China, could also represent the Red Guards during the Cultural Revolution from the 60s and 70s in China, where they were constantly trying to suppress and even force people to suicide for not supporting the Communist Party of China.
Yeah.
So that this kind of idea of authority, and usually male authority as well.
Yeah, usually male authority, and not to be too spoilery, because I know all of the people listening and watching haven't read the books, but surprise, surprise, this religious organization very much wants to control sexuality.
Wow.
And especially women's sexuality and sexuality of minority groups and marginalized communities. It's a bit implicit at times, but not very implicit. It's quite obvious once you start thinking about it that that's what they are up to.
One of those examples are the witches, Lo, which you wanted to talk about, where they their lifestyle is condemned by the magisterium. They are seen as not good mothers, which, you know, for in misogynist view is the worst sin that a woman can commit. So they're very much a matriarchal society, and they are, you know, constantly at odds with the magisterium because they do represent this kind of feminine force that is fighting against the masculine religious authority. And they also are kind of the boss in their relationships too, if you will, which is condemned.
Yeah. There's a lot there about how the witches, or at least a lot of the witches, dislike the magisterium because of their control of sexuality, and how the magisterium distrusts the witches, which, I mean, they obviously did in our world too. Just look at all the burnings.
Yeah.
But something that I think is very interesting about the witches is that they have a lot of parallels to people who live in Scandinavia and the north of Europe. That is probably not as obvious if you're not from that area. And because I know I've annoyed quite a few podcasts by emailing them and saying, "Hey, look at this thing. Maybe you should talk about this thing." When it comes to the books, that's actually how I first started talking to Chloe and Eliana of Girls Gone Canon, because in the books, and I'm not sure if this is mentioned in the show actually, but in the books, they say that the witches live in a part of the north that they refer to as L land, and I on principle do not say that word, but it starts with an L and then there's land, and the reason I don't say that word is because the first part of it, the L word, is a slur for Sami people. And Sami people are the people who are indigenous to Sweden, Norway, Finland, and Russia. If you actually look at a map of Sweden and what part of the contemporary country that used to be inhabited by Sami people, the part that is Sapmi, their land, it's actually quite literally half the country. The border, so to speak, is quite literally at half the country. But then Sweden colonized Sapmi. And so some of you have probably heard about this term for the geographical area that shall not be named. That is an actual area in northern Sweden and Finland, often said to be where Santa lives, because of course it's been turned into a tourist attraction, ignoring the legacy and the cultural heritage of indigenous peoples living there. So it means Sami land, but with a slur instead of Sami. So that was sort of the first clue that I went, okay, so the witches live in Sapmi essentially. That's interesting. And then the second thing that made me think was, okay, they mentioned one god of the witches' religion, and that is Jambeaka. And Jambeaka is also a figure in Sami religion. That's interesting. And then one of the places that we hear that the witches live is Lake Inara, which is in our world Inarejärvi in Finnish, or Enareträsk in Swedish. And that is an area that has been extremely important to the Inari Sami people who live in that area. There are several holy sites there, for instance, at this lake. So Pullman obviously has been inspired by real world indigenous people when creating the witches. And it's very interesting that they're in conflict with the church, because the church of our world has done its very best to erase their culture and religion throughout history.
Absolutely, and we've talked about this before on my channel, Lo, but the American version of that would be the Christian schools that were set up in America for natives who they weren't allowed to speak their own language, and they were reading from the Bible, and there was this idea of kind of assimilating them, which is, I use that in a very most negative connotation possible. Of assimilation is the opposite of acceptance, and of allowing other cultures to thrive. So the witches very much represent that, not just gendered, but also they really represent that this kind of idea of a culture that's the main misogynistic religious authority finds to be a threat, and therefore lashes out violently. And what's interesting is, if we want to continue on this thought of gender, Lo, I know you and I both have a lot of feels about Marissa Coulter, who works within this misogynistic and religiously intolerant power structure in order to gain power for herself. And a lot of people get hurt along the way, including children, especially children.
Yeah, and I think what makes Marissa Coulter such an interesting character is that you do sympathize for part of her struggle because she's a woman in a patriarchal society, and that yeah, and that patriarchal society will not let her strive and live her life as she would like to. But her solution to that is not to bring down the patriarchy and uplift the white supremacist hetero patriarchy, that and she doesn't try to like uplift other women or marginalized peoples. Instead she's like, okay, I'm personally going to get to the top, and it does not matter how many dead people I have to climb to get to that top. And that is unfortunately very similar to how a lot of white women in the world have gone about similar issues.
Her internalized misogyny also reminds me of Cersei. If Rohan's still in the chat, I'm sure she'll chime in. Oh, there she is, Rohan. There is also this this kind of idea of I'm a special woman. I'm 1 in 10,000. I deserve power. I'm not like other girls, which is a very, very internalized misogyny kind of view on being a woman who wants power, right? There's this idea of, she also uses her feminine wiles. Marissa Coulter and Cersei Lannister do both to kind of gather power in the way that they can. And so there is kind of this assumption that they will have to work within power, within this trappings of power, within the system in order to gain some of the power, but rather than trying to make it better for all people, including and especially women and girls. And I think her daughter then represents kind of wanting to change things rather than working within them.
Exactly.
I won't say who her daughter is because it's a little bit of a reveal, so I'll leave it there. About that, but I do think that that Marissa Coulter does represent that kind of misogynistic view of power, that it comes from men and you manipulate men into giving some of it to you.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a very, very interesting thing to analyze, and I'll have to write more about her at some point. And I have written about her a bit in my colonialism in historic materials essay, which is very spoiler heavy though. So if you haven't, if you're not caught up, don't read it. But I talk a lot there about her as a white woman, colonial woman, who does not see any problems with stepping on the backs of dead children to get to the top.
And pulling up the ladder after she's climbed it.
Yeah.
And she's also very contrasted with Mary Malone, who Lo and I are going to write an essay about. And I also have an upcoming essay about Marissa Coulter's demon being a monkey, because I am obsessed with monkey imagery. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. My first ever essay was about monkey imagery and Tyrion Lannister. It's kind of ironic that one of my first essays was about a character who I currently dislike quite a bit, but originally really liked Tyrion. But the monkey imagery is also very interesting to me, and the idea of grasping at power. The monkey is known to grasp for immortality in Chinese culture, and for wisdom, and for power as well. And Tyrion is also described as a grasping monkey in the series. So plug once again to check out my first ever essay. But so Marissa Coulter is an interesting kind of commentary on power, but so is Azriel.
Yes.
He is trying to find his own powers and go up against the Magisterium.
Yeah, and I mean, I see Astral as white man who's a revolutionary, in that his goals are good, I suppose, but he's not considering the fallout of his actions, um, for more marginalized people. And and not to spoil too much, but a phrase I repeated several times when I did my breakdowns of the episodes in season 2 of Historic Materials was uh, astral man-made climate change.
Yeah.
Just to subtly put that down on the table. And obviously, when it comes to climate change, both in Historic Materials and in our world, you can discuss what people are the most impacted by that. And that's generally marginalized communities, especially indigenous communities, which I would argue is the case in Historic Materials.
And people that are making the money off of it, like with big oil, tend to be white men.
Yep.
And those white women that have made it and don't want other women to make it as well. Sorry, I got a text question actually for us. Actually, I'll go ahead and address it now. Do we have recommendations for good queer fantasy? Actually, is an interesting question.
Ooh,
Since
that's fun.
we're being like bad, can we be like good?
I mean, it's more young adult, I guess, but I would say the Magnus Chase novels by Rick Riordan is the same person who wrote the Percy Jackson books. They also have good queer representation, but more in the later books. But Magnus Chase and the Gods of Asgard is a series along the same lines. Basically, the Norse gods exist in our contemporary world. They're up to shenanigans. And in the second and third book, one of the main characters is a gender fluid person who is absolutely amazing and just great. And also one of the other main characters is a hijabi girl. So, and she's just awesome, and a Valkyrie, and it's great. I recently got that first book for my bonus niece who turned 11, because I was like, you need some good influence in your life, so I'm just gonna give you this fantasy book and see what happens.
There was also something I read in middle school. The first book is called Hawk Song, and you can probably find the rest of the series through that. But I believe the third book, I want to say it's the third book, it might be the second book. The main character is lesbian and meets another woman, and it's quite a beautiful love story that is probably one of the best representations that I've seen in fantasy. So if you search Hawk Song, you'll find that series. That it's been a long time since I've read it, but it was pretty revolutionary for the early 2000s to be having a queer character at all, much less to make it a main character. We usually see queer characters and trans characters as the comic relief in series, especially sitcoms. But specifically fiction as well. We also see them as minor characters, which I know Micah loves minor characters and says that they're just as important. But to have a major character is very important.
Yes,
and we've also got a recommendation from Margot, who, with the caveat that they have not read it, but that they have heard about is that Priory? I can never say that.
Yeah.
Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon. And so
Cool.
they're hoping to get to that, read that, but that's also another recommendation we've got. So, and The Magicians. I've seen the show. I have not read
Yeah.
the books. I'm trying to think. I must be missing something, but I'm sure there is something queer in there. So Erin has read Priory of the Orange Tree and says that she loved it. So we've got that.
Anna also said Dreadnought.
Oh,
Apparently the main character is trans.
great.
So that's cool. I'm just adding things to my to read list.
Go back and watch this and write down all of this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Also,
So it's nice to have some positive recommendations, so that we're don't just kind of throw up our hands and say, well, everything sucks.
yeah, and also I just want to give a shout out to all the fanfiction writers out there, because sometimes people look down upon fan fictions, but it's a legit creative outpouring of made up people, and obviously a way to to find the representation that you don't always find in other places. So I know that Alicia and Rohan talked about their fics in the chat. So
plug. Yes. Yeah, Rohan and Alicia both write fan fiction, and we also have another recommendation from Erin. She talks about Jacqueline Carey to me all the time, and apparently a Starless by Jacqueline Carey is another option. So I do think that supporting queer authors or authors that are having queer characters, and also authors of color, I think that's a more productive way to look at these issues that we're talking about in the stream, which is to support people that deserve your support, and rather than, I hate to use this term because I know, especially, people that are going to watch or listen to this later, do separate these things. And I do think it is, I'm sorry, I'll say it now. You can, whatever. You can cancel me. But I think it's a mindless way to read fantasy, to not think about contemporary issues and to think about the author as a person, because it affects their work very much so. And I don't think that they can be separated, because the work is a reflection of them. It is an extension of them. I'm currently writing a fantasy novel, and one of the characters is bi, and is very much a reflection of myself and kind of my inner thoughts growing up, realizing that I'm not heterosexual. So I think that I think that supporting people who deserve your support and understanding when things are problematic and not ignoring that is the most mindful way to read science fiction and fantasy, because these worlds are literally created, and a lot of times science fiction is in the future. So to keep repeating these harmful tropes is really, I think, a testament to the lack of creativity on the author's part.
Yeah. And just I realized I have been neglectful in not mentioning our friend Grant Pierce's work, Hidden King, on Twitter, and his latest book, Agent of Truth, which is the sequel to The Erased, has a trans lesbian, or queer at least, character who's just the best, and I love her, and I want all the best for her in the future. And I also had the pleasure of advising him on writing that character as a trans character, because he wanted someone who actually had some experience to look at that over before he published it, which I think is a extremely clever, ethical and moral and just good thing to do. If you don't have that experience but you want to write about it, have someone look it over. And I mean, I didn't have that many complaints, I'll be honest, but still, it's awesome. So yeah,
I
check
believe
out.
too, because Lo, I don't care about spoilers, which I call content previews, because spoilers is a negative term. If I was invited on someone else's version of Buddy Banter, I'd want to talk about how content previews should be not demonized. And, anyway, but I do believe also the Poppy War, one of the characters does turn out to be gay, correct? Because you've read ahead of me.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So once again. Have you heard the gospel? It's like, have you met Ted? But I'm like, have you heard of the Poppy War? There are a lot of books out there by authors who are a lot more aware of things that are going on. And I also think that I think it just makes us, to me at least, I would rather also be a part of these kinds of fandoms that where the material is a lot more creative and a lot more representative. I would think that the fandom as a whole would hopefully be more accepting and more diverse as well. I think fandoms benefit from better material, and I think it's lazy writing. Just in the end.
Yeah, like my shirt says, get your priorities queer.
Exactly. I love that you wear that shirt, Lo. It's perfect.
Yeah, I felt like it was very appropriate for this stream.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot, Lo. Are there any closing thoughts that you have about any of these issues we've talked about, any of the fiction that we've mentioned?
No, just that this is a flaw I have, by the way. I always say no before actually going on a long spiel.
I don't have closing thoughts. I have a closing novel.
Yeah, exactly. No, but I just think that when you do research, for instance, so in social science and humanities, you often talk about if the researcher can be completely objective when doing research. And a lot of more contemporary thought is that no, you can never be completely objective because you always have preconceived notions that you bring into what you're doing. Even if it's just, I want to research this thing because I'm interested in it, that brings something into it from the beginning. So I think it's just impossible to expect that an author of a fictional work would be completely neutral when they write. So even if we don't have to accept their views always, we can do queer readings of books, but we have to acknowledge the context, and we have to acknowledge where the author is coming from. And obviously there's whole fields of studies looking into gender and race and disability and whatnot in books. So for us as, just ordinary people enjoying things, I think it's very reasonable that we bring politics into fiction as well.
Yeah, and obviously we before we started the stream, Yogi came in the chat and was like, spoiler alert, no, because the question is, can we separate politics from fantasy? And we really don't think you can. And I think that we've made our case here, and we've looked at specific examples of fiction that hopefully you listeners at least had some familiarity with, at least one of them, hopefully you did. And so I think that we have shown that the reason that we can't, and that marginalized people specifically have an issue with separating art from the artist and from not seeing these contemporary issues and just kind of enjoying it in world. And actually, I think my enjoyment of it is enhanced by thinking about these issues, because I am interested in issues of colonialism, racism, and sexism, which are all intertwined. So I think that for me, it helps my enjoyment. And that's why I was really glad that you picked this topic because it's something that we're both very passionate about. And, Buddy Banter is all about the buddy. But I'm so glad that you picked a topic that I have already thought a lot about. Lo, thank you for being my buddy, and thank you for bantering with me, and thank you very much for picking this topic. And please check out Lo's blog. They have a lot of amazing analysis. And like I said, I am now a podcast. So if you want to listen to this, I'm on Podbean, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Anchor. So if you go to my Anchor, you can find all the platforms that I'm on, and also on Podbean if you like Podbean. So please like and subscribe. I've got a little icon there in the bottom right. If you click that little picture of me, then you will subscribe to this channel. If you turn on those notifications, you'll know when I upload something. So tomorrow I'm going to record a video / episode with a full panel about the Air Nation from Avatar: The Last Airbender. And once again, I have some Song of Ice and Fire content coming up. I'm going to look at black and white and yin and yang symbolism in A Song of Ice and Fire. I've got that Hua Mulan essay coming up where I compare Alar/Sorella and Brave Danny Flint to Hua Mulan. And my next His Dark Materials stuffs is going to be with Lo about Mary Malone and how she squares religion and science. And I also have that Coulter essay about her demon and monkey imagery. And I'm working on finishing the Witcher, and I need to also get into the Poppy War, which you may have heard of a couple times during this episode. And yeah, Amy, good point. It is late for Lo. It's past midnight for them. They are a trooper. Thank you, because we could have done this earlier and it would have been better for you, but maybe not as many people would have been able to make it into the chat. So thank you, Lo. You are I already said trooper, and that's the only word I could think of. But it's very much appreciated, Lo. So thank you once again for being my buddy and bantering with me. Did you have last words for the people?
I don't know. I had a blast talking to you about this. It was so much fun. Probably one of the just best streams I've been on in a long time. I wanted to just briefly say a lot of people enjoyed my shirt. I just want to say that it's from a Swedish non-profit that works with sexual health and reproductive rights. And you can find this shirt on elise133.com. So that's ELISE 1933.com. Yeah, the money goes to good stuff. If you want to have the awesome Get Your Priorities Queer shirt. They also have other shirts. And they do ship to the US. And yeah, just thank you all for this. It was so much fun. I'll be back on my trans BS soon enough with an essay about the Night of the Laughing Tree. And then more His Dark Materials, and then we'll see where it gets me.
Yay, I'm so excited. Yeah, thank you again, Lo, and thanks for staying up late. Please check out all of Lo's links. Follow us both on Twitter. I do polls, and I post. I'm currently rereading the X-Men comics, so I post a lot of fun screenshots of 60s and 70s problematic X-Men lines. But it's not just then. There's also in the 2000s when Joss Whedon was writing it. Also very problematic things going on there. So I have a really good time, even though I'm a huge X fan, showing where it needs help and needs work. So Thank you once again, everyone. And we will see you next time. Please subscribe to my channel and to my podcast. And I will see you next time. Bye-bye.